Gentlemen, good afternoon. I will not forget, as I did on Friday, to introduce myself. My name is 𝗙𝘂𝗁𝗂𝗁𝗂𝗁𝗂𝗁. I am the Program and Communications Officer for the United Nations System in Guyana. Thank you very much for being here. We are here for a special event, and we are very pleased that you are here at such short notice. Ambassador Carolyn Rodrigues-Birkett, Guyana's permanent representative to the United Nations, Ms. Yeşim Oruç, UN Resident Coordinator, Excellencies of the Diplomatic Corps, UN heads of agencies, and other UN colleagues in the room, representatives of civil society, the private sector, NGOs, youth organizations, partners, members of the press. Thank you all for being here today. It is my pleasure to welcome you to this afternoon's event on the Summit of the Future. For your information, the event is being live streamed on our Facebook page, so yes, the viewing audience will see you in the room. And at this stage, I'll just give you a brief overview of our program so that we have a smooth flow for the afternoon. First, we will watch a short, very short 1-minute explainer video about the Summit of the Future. This will be followed by opening remarks by Yeşim, then our feature presentation by the ambassador. Then we will open the floor to the audience for a question and answer segment, and then we close. So we do anticipate only keeping you for about an hour and a half. After the official event, we encourage you to stay and have a meet and greet as we're all here in the same space before we go home. So now we'll just look at a short video.
The Summit of the Future is about how we cooperate at the global level to solve our biggest shared problems. And that includes the problem of not having implemented and not having reached some of the goals that we've already agreed, including the Sustainable Development Goals, the principles of the UN Charter, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the Paris Agreement on Climate Change, and so many other goals and agreements that we've already reached that would really deliver the future we want. But it's also about how we cooperate to address the new opportunities, fast developing digital technology such as AI, and how we minimize the risks of some of those developments. It's about how we solve problems at the global level, how we work together, and how we deliver a future that is fairer, more sustainable, and better for all of humanity, and not just the few who benefit these days from these developments.
Once again, thank you. I stand on established protocol, but wow, what a privilege for me to be seated next to our permanent representative in New York, the Ambassador Carolyn Rodrigues-Birkett. It's not rare for us to have you. You have a very, very busy agenda, of course, with a seat at the top table of the United Nations. So I'm absolutely thrilled. Summit of the Future, I'm not going to mince my words. The international world order, the international multilateral system with the UN at its core are really being challenged by the many problems that the humanity is facing. A few years ago, at the 75th anniversary of the UN Human Rights Declaration, member states pledged to strengthen the global governance and asked the Secretary General on his recommendations to address how we can strengthen global governance. The Secretary General responded with many papers, 11 briefs and agenda items, but ultimately it's the member states agreed that a summit this year is essential for world leaders to get together and decide on the future of our multilateral system with the UN at its core and many of the things that we've already, as the international community, committed to, as was said earlier by our colleague, who's one of the summit secretariat leaders. The summit is going to be is going to end up in an intergovernmentally agreed and action-oriented pact for the future. In working in Guyana, I'm very cognizant of not using these big, laden words in pact for the future, ills of humanity, addressing all these big things. but it really is at the core a pact for the future that allows the multilateral system with the UN at its core, the rules-based system, to survive the many arising challenges. From artificial intelligence to climate change to human rights to old and new challenges that face humanity. And that's why the Secretary General is absolutely thrilled that this take place this year before he demits office, of course. And I'm sure, I don't want to put words into his mouth, but this will be the legacy of the Secretary General's tenure, of course, as we've experienced really jarring events in the past few years where the international system has been tried. The Pact for the Future is being is designed around 5 main thematic areas, and I understand it's being negotiated around those 5 areas. I have very little experience in intergovernmental processes, so I'm very humbled here to be with you and in the presence, of course, of Ambassador Talbot as well. But the 5 chapters are sustainable development and financing for development. The second chapter is international peace and security. The third is science, technology, digital cooperation. The fourth is youth and future generations. And finally, transforming global governance, including global financial architecture. There will be, if member states agree, separate compacts on future generations and digital that will also be appended to the summit declaration, to the Pact of the Future, rather. So this is sort of the rundown of what the summit is all about. It's all about making sure the international global multilateral system is able to weather the challenges we're facing. Ambassador, your government's leadership has been remarkable in the negotiations. We had a briefing before on Guyana's negotiations, and I had no idea what was going on in all the multiple angles in which you're approaching the Pact for the Future. As was said in this introduction, some of the existing commitments, from Paris to Sustainable Development Goals, are part and parcel of what the Summit of the Future is supposed to reinforce as well. I was reading an article just this morning on using a wedding analogy to the Summit of the Future. Something old, something new, something borrowed, something blue. Old are existing commitments, including to the UN Charter, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Paris Agreement, SDGs. New, the future, the youth of the future, the problems of the future. Borrowed, there's been so much happening, including within the Caribbean space, of intergovernmental partnerships, of advancing like the Bridgetown Initiative, etc. So there's a lot that we can build on. So borrowed and blue, the United Nations, of course. Making sure that the United Nations, our blue helmets, our blue flag continue to serve the people of the world. In Guyana, we've experienced a lot of the progress around the commitments on the old and new for young people, but also existing commitments, be it SDGs. Last year, we benefited from the Voluntary National Review, where SDG targets are advancing at dizzying pace, actually. But I will engage you, Madam Ambassador, now, on how you see, we're absolutely thrilled, of course, that you're able to speak to us on this, but how you see the UN, the multilateral system coming out of this summit. Are we going to really be able to come out as the organization that's going to be fit for purpose, that's going to allow the international community to get back on track, to recommit to multilateralism that delivers for everyone, for everywhere? And maybe you can also share with us some of the lines of negotiations that you're involved in or that your government's involved in, so that we get a sense of what are the Guyanese priorities in these, and what's sort of shaping these negotiations. And with that, I thank you once again. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Madam Resident Coordinator Yeşim Oruç, and I want to recognize our Minister of Parliamentary Affairs and Governance, Minister 𝗙𝘂𝗁𝗂𝗏, who's here with us, members of the diplomatic community, colleague, I see my colleague Ambassador George Talbot here, young people, ladies and gentlemen all. It's a real pleasure to be here. It's always good to be home, and it's better when it's mango season. But it's also a great privilege, I would say, to be engaging you and engaging with my own country people as well, given the years that I've been out of Guyana, so grounding, as it were, I would say. But let me begin by thanking you, Yeşim, for inviting me to speak. I didn't realize there would be all these cameras, so I hope that you'll forgive me if I don't do such a good job after all. When there are cameras, you have to do a really, really good job, right? But I think it's a very important engagement, the Summit of the Future. And I have to tell you that I've heard many times, another summit again, what will it achieve? But I think it's important for the international community to rally around common objectives. It's not very easy to get to those that endpoint sometimes, but I think it's good for us to be talking. President Ali is going to attend the Summit of the Future, and he would certainly be speaking more on not just our priorities, but also what we see as some of the challenges and what we are doing as a country. But before I go any further, Yeşim, I want to thank you for the work that you've done over these last 3 years or so in Guyana. You've traveled with us on this very, I would say, interesting part of our journey in Guyana at this point in time. And your contributions and your collaboration will not be forgotten. I think that you are a true representative of what the United Nations is all about. You are a model civil servant, international civil servant, and I think that Guyana was very fortunate to have you during this point. And so I think it would be important for me to also situate the Summit of the Future. Many of you, or some of you, would remember we had the MDGs, the Millennium Development Goals. And the MDGs were only directed to the developing countries. They were not goals for us as a global community. We got somewhere with that, but not very far. For Guyana, we made some progress, but it didn't take the world very far, our global efforts for the MDGs. And so then the SDGs came about, and now that is for everyone, for countries big or small, poor or rich. And we set about the 17 goals, as you know, which we're supposed to achieve by 2030. We will not. In fact, the latest statistic is that we're just about 17% achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals. And last year there was a summit on the SDGs, and I think all of the countries came and spoke about the challenges they face. COVID-19, of course, set us back very far, but even before COVID-19, we know that we were not going to be able to achieve the SDGs. And so, Yeşim, you mentioned the Secretary General's our Common Agenda report, where he recommended the Summit of the Future. And last year, we had some discussions. There was a ministerial meeting, and here we are now for preparing for the Summit of the Future. I think that there is an urgent need for the summit, and I'll tell you why. One, we need to turbocharge SDG implementation. We really need to do that. But also we're seeing a growing mistrust among nations right now. We're living in a very, very polarized world, and there are lots of concerns about global peace and security. We have more conflicts in the world today than we've seen since World War II, more. This is not a very good place to be. But also there's a deeper recognition, I would say, because of the other issues I mentioned, that some of our institutions are not fit for purpose. And you talk about the global financial architecture. Some of our financial institutions, some of the institutions of the UN, like the Security Council, and also a real concern about the kind of future we will bequeath to those coming after us, what kind of planet we would leave for them. And it is in this context that the Summit of the Future will be held. And so it will bring together world leaders. It's held just a day before, 2 days before the high-level debate in the General Assembly that we have every year during high-level week. So we are expecting a high number of leaders to be there. And you ask what we expect we will come out at the other side of this with. The intention is that we will seize the moment, leaders will seize the moment to mend the mistrust that we're seeing, or to, if we could try to erode that mistrust, but also to commit to enhance an effective global cooperation, because we see a deficit there as well, and to tackle emerging threats. We're seeing a rise in terrorism, and a lot of our young people are involved in different parts of the world. And so how do we confront these challenges? How do we address those? But also how do we make use of the opportunities? There are always opportunities. And we hope that we will have a very ambitious document, the pact that you mentioned of the future, to be a very ambitious document. And I don't want to overuse the word ambitious, because we like to say that in the UN quite a lot. But I should mention that that will also be accompanied by a declaration on future generations, those who haven't even been born yet, and also a global digital compact, in recognition too that we have a digital divide. And if we don't narrow that digital divide, we are going to leave behind many. We see even right here, as we try to connect our country digitally, that we still have a far way to go, and we're working on that. I just want to mention some of the key themes that we intend, or that we're working on right now as we negotiate to push progress on. And we're hoping that we will also be able to strengthen multilateralism in that process. I mentioned the first one earlier about turbocharging the SDG implementation, unlocking finance for climate action and development, and I separate those two, because we're talking about climate action, climate finance, and also on the development side, and not mixing up development finance with climate finance. And driving real reform of the international financial architecture and the Security Council, and also to create a new emergency platform, very important. COVID came, and we also see hurricanes come and go, we see floods come and go, and the UN does not have an emergency platform to deal with these. How do we help countries when we have these emergencies, when a crisis hit? And another theme is renewing governance of outer space in order to reduce risk. Guyana does not plan to have a space station or build a shuttle, but we see that space is becoming a very contentious issue in terms of what is happening in outer space. And so looking at that, and how do we actually reap the benefits from that, rather than for us to have challenges there. The other one is to embed young people at the heart of decision making, not in a lip service way, but really to include young people in decision making. I mentioned earlier closing the digital divides, and also to revitalizing our collective approach to peace and security with the new agenda for peace, and also to embrace an expansive model, a model that would encompass development, human rights, gender, and looking at the links between climate and security. What are Guyana's priorities? Now, I think you would have heard before the term that our foreign policy is externalizing our local policies, right? And you would hear the President speak about our priority in terms of energy security, climate security, and food security. And so, of course, these would be our priorities in the United Nations, and how we put forward this in the various negotiations, whether it's a summit of the future or other negotiations, this is what we do as the permanent mission in New York. And so our job is basically to advocate for these to be reflected in the summit, in the pact of the future. And how do we do this? There are 193 countries in the UN. Now, it would be a very hard job to have 193 countries in one room negotiating each one by itself. So what we have is different groups, and Guyana negotiates within different groups. So the G77 is one group. The Alliance for Small Island Developing States as well, AOSIS, we have priorities there as well. The L69 group is one that looks at reform of the Security Council, and we're part of that group. And we believe that amplifying our collective voices would have a greater impact. But there are times when you will have to go alone as well on matters if you do not have a similar position in some of these groups. Sometimes it's also important that you choose to go alone. So far, we have been doing all our negotiations through these various groups. But you also have, for example, the non-aligned movement, they're very strong on disarmament, for example, and we're a member of the non-aligned movement. I would like to highlight some specific priorities, just breaking down a bit what I said, on climate change. It goes without saying that Guyana would be strong on climate change. It's the defining issue of our time, and we have been leading on climate long before now, advocating, for example, for forests and the recognition of forests and the services, the ecosystem services that the forests provide, but also certainly mitigation and adaptation, protecting the most vulnerable communities while we transition to a low-carbon world. We think we have more authority to speak on these issues because we've been doing this back home here. And very importantly on the climate, that financing commitments be fulfilled. Some of you would recall that the Paris Agreement had in it that the developed world will provide to the developing world $100 billion per year by 2020. We're in 2024. And that has not been fulfilled. And so we call for the climate finance commitments to be fulfilled and other developing and other financial commitments as well for development to be fulfilled. I mentioned forests already. Very important to recognize the interlinkages between climate, peace, and security. As you will recall, we had a signature event during our presidency on climate, looking at climate change, conflict, and food insecurity. And I think what we heard there from the more than 80 countries that spoke, the great majority spoke about this being very important for us to focus on as a global community. And we believe that it is necessary for the United Nations, not least the Security Council, to consider and to address the adverse impacts of climate change on the maintenance of global peace and security. I could tell you some countries don't believe that the Council should discuss climate, but we believe that we should. We have, I would say, Guyana achieved some relative success. And why I would say that very humbly, the SDGs conference just concluded. And one of the contentious issues was linking climate and security. And SDGs countries, if you're telling the world this is an issue for you, how could the rest of the world say it's not? We don't believe you. So for the first time, there is mention of security. I'm talking here about global peace and security in the context of climate. Very nuanced, but it's the first time that it's mentioned in a UN outcome document. I mentioned food security as a priority, no surprise there. But what we are seeing, and I should mention this, when the SDGs were approved in 2015, the decade before that, we saw food insecurity reducing. We were doing well. as a global community, we were reducing food insecurity. The year the SDGs was approved, we have food insecurity growing every year. And now we are seeing acute food insecurity. We have over 280 million. This is acute, so the really, really bad type of food insecurity. But we have over 800 million people still food insecure in this world. So we have to continue to advocate for that. And in our advocacy, we're talking about the transformation of global agri-food systems, that this must be considered in the Pact for the Future, so that we can have a more resilient system, we can have more nutritious food produced and sold at reasonable rates for people to be able to achieve food security. And also the role of conflict and climate must be factored into the food security discussion. When we look at where we have the most food insecurity, it's in the countries with conflict. And if those countries are amongst the most vulnerable to climate change, it doubles up in a way. So we also are advocating for that. Financing, it's one of the vexed issues, I would say. Many countries have not been able to make progress in the SDG implementation because of financing. And we believe that the developed countries should shoulder their historic responsibilities and fulfill their commitments to provide financing for developing countries. It's not aid we're talking about here. We're also talking about a fair system. You have countries, because you're classified as a middle-income country, you have to borrow at very high interest rates. And some countries that might be at your same level in terms of GDP per capita can borrow at a less cost than you. It's unfair, an unfair system. And so we call for those things to be addressed, for the international financial institutions to listen, and so that we can have a more fair system. There was the commitment, and I know we have Jane and some of our developed countries' ambassadors here, a commitment to provide 0.7% of GNI by the developed world in ODA. That has not been met by several countries as well. And the reform of the Security Council, I'm sure you may have questions on this. The Security Council is the most undemocratic organ of the United Nations. We sit there now, and some days I'm amazed at it. You have 5 countries with a veto that can scuttle anything, that you bring there. And you have seen in recent times where you have 13 countries voting in favor of 14, and 1 country says no. And that's it. And so we believe that in any reform of the Security Council, that first it must be more representative. Could you imagine that you don't have, if we're talking about permanent members, Africa is not there as a permanent member. That's a historical injustice. Small states as well, a lot of them, I think we need more representation. So the Security Council reform is extremely important. I talked about peace and security already, and it goes without saying that this would be a priority for us. Not only because I mentioned earlier, not only because we're seeing more conflicts, but right here in our little Guyana, we face a real threat now. We face a real threat as well. And so we are advocating for conflicts to be settled peacefully under the United Nations Charter in accordance with international law. Because even if a conflict is not near to us, it affects us. When ships are attacked in the Red Sea, the price of shipping goes up. That would hit our, and it is. Maybe we don't see it on the news very often. But if ships have to take a longer route, and if they have to pay higher costs for insurance, it passes on. Those costs will pass on to us. So we see this as a very important priority. So those are the things that I would like to to mention. I think that we in Guyana, we have been doing very well in the sense that we've been moving forward with our development. And we've been able to do that, and you know the reason why we've been able to do that. We've been able to do that not just because we now have oil, but because we have put in place really prudent policies as well. But we're not out of the woods too. We have a lot to do. We're transforming our infrastructure, our health, education, and so on. But we're part of a global system. And anything that affects the global system will affect us. And this is why we have to remain engaged. And so we hope as these negotiations continue, they're not easy negotiations. I probably, if you ask me later, I can tell you what are some of the difficult areas. But we're hoping that we will have a very ambitious pact for the future, one that will really bring change for our world. And Guyana will continue to advocate for this, aligning with many other countries as well, because we share similar views. I would also say that the support that we receive as well from different agencies, the UN agencies and so on, I think it's extremely important. And the UN will be central as we go forward in implementing the Pact for the Future. Thank you, Yeşim.
Thank you, Ambassador. Wow, what a tour de force, at least for me to listen in to what's happening in New York. Absolutely amazing. And also, it's not apparent to me day in, day out, all these different negotiation tracks, how you're breaking down. I just know the 5 chapters, right? That there are 5 headings and like there is a bunch of actions underneath. But for member states like yourself, how you break them down into climate security linkage, SIDS climate security and food insecurity. And we just had the State of the Food Insecurity report come out this morning, or was it this morning? This morning, this very morning. Financing and not just aid, but also, you know, the old commitments that have been made in Addis and elsewhere. Reform of the Security Council often talked about. So in the general peace and security dynamics and how these impact not only development of nations large and small, but always, Ambassador, my experience has been it's the most vulnerable in those countries who get the most impacted when if something blows up in the Red Sea. It's not going to be the well-to-do in Guyana who get hurt, but it's going to be somebody who's farming, who's tilling the land, who's trying to eke out a living, a woman. And I saw just as I said women, I saw our Minister of Human Services also, 𝗙𝗂𝗁𝗂𝗏, step in. But a woman who's suffering from something or another will be the one who's going to pay the price. When the global peace and security architecture is damaged, when there's less respect for this global peace and security, again, it's the most vulnerable who will suffer. People can move if they have the means, but a woman who's a survivor of gender-based violence, that's the one who's going to be the one who needs the system the most, starting at its locally, starting nationally, starting globally. So I'm really inspired by hearing what you're saying, but we've had a very, very thoughtful audience so far, sort of nodding and looking at us at multiple points that you were making, Ambassador. So I'm going to and I'm looking at my real boss, Colette, to tell me that if it's time for, there you are. Is it time for me now to open the floor for questions? I'll be moderating this session. I have the privilege to moderate this session. I'm going to call on the floor to ask questions. Please don't be shy. There are many cameras, but it is Guyana. It's all family. We've all been here in this room before, so please don't be shied by the camera. Not least because Summit of the Future is all about making this international system and the UN not only the purview of you and me and a few UN bureaucrats and a few diplomats. It's about whether this whole international system actually belongs to you, and many people who are not in the room. So I'm really turning to you all in the audience to pose questions to Ambassador Rodrigues. Let's take advantage of her being here. Oh, there is a question. Bravo. And please introduce yourselves. I know, but maybe Ambassador Rodrigues doesn't remember who you may be.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Tyreek Scott. I am a volunteer with UNICEF Guyana and Suriname and United Nations Guyana. Two questions for the ambassador. Good afternoon, by the way. Lovely presentation. Thank you. First question, how will Guyana prioritize enforcing climate change initiatives, and how can young people participate in those? And the second question, how will the Summit of the Future ensure that the protection of children's rights is upheld? And how can young people in Guyana actively get involved in any initiatives that may be produced from the Summit of the Future? Just my two questions.
All right, the young people in the room have spoken, so that's wonderful. And really, I mean, young people and climate change go hand in hand, but so you have two questions, one on climate change and how youth can be involved, and the other one on rights of children and youth, and how the summit will provide coverage and protection for their rights going forward. Maybe I can take a few more questions. I'll take one from here.
Ambassador, thank you so much for a wonderful, interesting, and thank you. I wanted to ask, I'm Gillian Smith. I'm the FAO representative here in Guyana, and we just mentioned that the State of Food and Nutrition report for 2024 was launched, and one of the things that came up was that the cost of a healthy, affordable diet is actually increasing. It's very high in the Caribbean. Guyana has been at the forefront, especially in the Caribbean, of leading the charge of increasing production, trying to transform the food systems. And I wondered, in terms of the Summit of the Future and what Guyana wants to say to the rest of the world about sharing some of the really good things that have happened and really demanding, I think, some of the actions that are required by other partners in the world. Thank you.
Ambassador, I'll let you answer these two questions and then do another round. I see our High Commissioner is ready too to answer a question. Oh, yeah, two more? Okay, perfect. I forget, so I take notes, but she retains them. That's why she's there and I'm not.
Well, thank you so much. My name's Jane Miller, British High Commissioner. But thank you so much for a really thoughtful presentation, and I have about 1,000 questions. But, you know, reflecting on what you were saying right at the very beginning, how do we move this whole agenda from being a talk shop, you know, from just being another report? And I'm really interested to hear on some of the tricky questions. You alluded to some difficult discussions. I mean, globally, we're seeing a rollback in women's rights, for example. I mean, Guyana is one of the countries which has maintained many rights for women, you know, safe abortion, family planning. You have a moral authority. How is Guyana really using that within the UN system to be really seeing women and girls? There's not a specific chapter on women and girls, but I know it's integrated into many of those things. But what is your ambition? But really taking it away from being a talk shop. You know, we had women equality as example under the MDGs, and it's going in the wrong direction. How do we see progress? And my second question was about youth, but very well articulated. I think, as everybody said, you can't do it for people without them there. You know, so how are young people in the room to really make that difference? Thank you.
I'm just going to see if anybody from the audience before we have the UN.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Renata Chakasang. Forgive the voice. I don't know what's going on with it. Hi, Ambassador. Nice to see you here. So, peace, global peace and security. Women are the most, as you said, women are the most affected when there are issues of conflict. So we should be in on the front end. So we really should be more robust with involving women in peace and security negotiations, because we often are we get the short end of the stick in conflict, but not only in conflict, but in issues of violence. In the Caribbean and in Guyana, we know that gender-based violence is a real issue. We're still struggling to get a grip on it, despite our lovely legislation. And recently I attended, the ministers will know this, from UN Women, a discussion on getting a national action plan for women, peace and security, not only in Guyana, but across the Caribbean. So how would that work with your negotiations? And then the second question is with regard to biodiversity and, how do I put it? Diversity in plants, food plants, for us to maintain our food security. We know we've got ambitious plans to reduce the regional food import bill by 25%. We in Guyana, we should be the food basket, but a lot of the seeds that we're getting right now have been new seeds, and they're seeds that are coming from outside, so they're not really resilient for our climate, even as our climate is changing. So is there a discussion, is there a way for that to be part of the discussion? It's not necessarily GMOs, but saving our heirloom seeds. And we are not using our native plants sufficiently.
Thank you. Final question, Gerardo, my colleague from UNDP. Please. Just one more so we can, so I don't keep my UNDP.
Oh, okay. You know, the world has changed significantly, deeply from 1945 when the UN was founded just at the end of the Second World War. And two main pillars of that order, financial institutions, the Bretton Woods institutions, and the Security Council has changed, let's say, little, only expansion from 11 to 15, like almost 50 years ago. But of course, there has been many ideas and proposals, you know, like expanding the permanent members with non-veto power, secure some regional representation, and there has been many proposals. Where is the discussion? And of course, there is a lot of resistance to change, and there has also been different proposals in terms of the financial institutions. But do you expect any, I wouldn't say significant change, but at least some moving the ball forward in those two areas that are very important?
Thank you. I don't know if you're able to retain, I got 7 questions. Climate change and the role of youth, the rights of children, and how they can, youth can actively participate, the issue of healthy diets and the cost of living and food security. How are we injecting that into the summit discussions? How do we turn this from a talk shop into actually meaningful, concrete actions? The Women in Peace Security agenda, especially you mentioned how projecting domestic policy internationally. Of course, the whole GBV thing has been, with Minister Persaud and others in CSNRG membership here, has been my day-to-day life. So really looking forward to hearing from you on that. In biodiversity, including the seed bank issues there, is that under the science technology? Where does that fit? And finally, the big question that Gerardo put out there, you know, the real biggie ones, the elephants in the room, Security Council and the financial architecture that we have with the Bretton Woods institutions. So easy question. Very easy. You have 5 minutes. I'm just kidding.
Yes. Okay, so let me start to ramble. Not rumble, ramble. I'll start with Mr. Scott's question on climate and how we enforce, I think you said how we enforce initiatives. I think what we are seeing is that the commitments, there's no shortage of commitments really on climate, but we're not seeing them implemented. And so we're hoping that in this Summit of the Future, we will be able to have included in that document something that would take us further than where we are right now. And that is what we continue to advocate for in the negotiations. On children's rights, you ask about children's rights. And this is not only in the Summit of the Future do we speak about this, we talk about this in the Security Council all the time. Because apart from what we're seeing happening to children all over the world, somehow we're seeing progress in some areas, but in other areas not. And especially where we're having conflicts right now, women and children are the ones that are suffering the most. I give you one example. If we take Syria, that conflict is going on now for over 10 years. Could you imagine if you were an 8-year-old when that conflict started, and you're 18 now, and you had no school for 10 years? That young person would be ripe for recruitment into a world that we may not want them to. And so that's from the conflict standpoint. But also just children and access to education. We have many places where the access to education that sometimes we may take for granted here, that we don't see that elsewhere. And so I think it's extremely important for us because we have achieved universal primary education. We're close to achieving universal secondary education. And in 2025, we would have free university by the education, tertiary education. And so we know how important this is, and so we advocate for this for the world as well. We'll be a better place if all our children are able to have this kind of access. How do you get involved? I think the internet has done a wonderful thing. Speak about this. Speak about whenever you have the opportunity. Don't ever keep your hands down when you can put it up and speak for children, speak for young people. On Jillian's question about food security, this is our mantra. I think people get tired. When they see Guyana, they see food security. But I think what we also see is because we advocate so strongly, we're invited to speak in many, many circles on this. I said earlier about the issue of better, agro-systems, but also technology transfer, and it relates somewhat to Renata's question as well about biodiversity and so on. Technology transfer, I have to tell you, is one of the contentious issues, and I'll come to some of them just, but it's one of the contentious issues because some countries want that to be conditional. I would not transfer any technology to you. It must be conditional. You either pay for it or some other thing. And it's a bit, it would not help us, I think, if we go down that road. And we have seen what, during the COVID-19 pandemic, how we suffered because of that. Financing for food security is also important. We see, and Guyana has, again, we have, in the last 3 years, I think, I know the percentage is over 300% that we've invested in agriculture here, in terms of increasing from what we were 3 years ago to now. And so we are putting in a lot of investment in our agriculture. Not that we didn't want to do it before, we didn't have the resources to do it. We have a bit more now, but for many countries this is a problem, just having the financing to invest.
I don't want to interrupt you there, but only 5% of global climate finance is going to agriculture, by the way.
Yes.
So that's also like there's multiple circles there.
Exactly. And looking for, when we talk about technology transfer as well, looking for crops in terms of research that are resilient. Like you mentioned in terms of climate now. I know in some parts of the world they are growing rice, for example, with a very short, within a very short time span, because of the weather pattern. So looking at that. But I must say this is a Summit of the Future document. It might not go into a lot of detail, but it would be general. In terms of Jane's question, generally in the UN, the issue of sexual and reproductive rights is a very contentious issue. I'm very proud that for us, Guyana, we've gone a far way in this. Gil Teixeira is here, our minister. 1994, I was still very young, Gil. but she piloted that legislation on the medical termination of pregnancy. And at the time, it perhaps would not have dawned on us how transformative that would have been to give women the rights over their own bodies. If you turn on the television now, you would see in some places where this is an issue, right? And many times, I love all the men in this room, many times men want to decide what we do with our bodies. But in the UN, this is a contentious issue. That's just one part of it. Part of it is that how early should we be introducing children to education on these things. So some countries that are more conservative would not like to see that. Talk shop. You know, as foreign minister, I used to always complain about talk shops. And then I decided to be in one now, right? But I think, you know, we should talk. We should talk. But we should try to always walk that talk as well. Because the you know, proof of the pudding is, in this regard, is implementation. And this links to Gerardo's question. How do we implement? And financing is a big one, but also commitment from government and political will. We cannot just see this as an external problem as well, political will. And in some parts, you may not see that. And so I think it would speak to that as well. We don't see the UN itself, and we recognize this, in terms of the reform of the financial architecture. What we do at the UN is to advocate for this strongly. The UN is basically the moral voice of the world on these issues. We know the international financial institutions got their own voting and control mechanisms. So we have to continue to call out to those countries that can help us in this process. And the UN, I think, is doing that. And we will continue to call for this to stop being an unjust system. I would touch on Security Council reform. And you ask, we've been talking about this for, 4 decades now. And I think we have seen a little bit of a movement on it. And because of the veto being used in the last couple of years so often, I think people are now really coming into these discussions. And the negotiations on Security Council reform, it's different to the Pact for the Future. So I don't expect the Pact for the Future to include much on that at all. Maybe just a small part, because it's one of the contentious issues as well. But the intergovernmental negotiations, we continue with that. It's been going on for some time now. And why I say the needle has moved a little bit. We have been asking, a lot of us small states, why don't you webcast the first day of the debate every year? And there was a huge pushback because people didn't want the world to see what countries were saying. Some countries didn't want the world to see what they were saying. And we wanted the world to see what we were saying. And so now we have gotten that, a little movement. Now, the contentious issue is one of the main ones. Should we expand the permanent membership? That's where the veto is.
4 of the permanent members are
Yes,
represented in the
yes,
Just saying.
yes. Now, I'll tell you what Guyana's position is. Guyana's position is that if we're going to keep we would like to see the veto abolished. We would like to see that abolished. But if it's going to be kept, because we don't think people give up power, if it's going to be kept, then any additional permanent member should have the same right as well. We also believe that there should be thresholds on the veto, limitations on the use of the veto. In the case of crimes of genocide, serious crimes, you shouldn't be able to use the veto. Some people don't believe that that should be the case. So it's still very, very contentious. Guyana also advocates, as CARICOM, because we're part of CARICOM in this, for a rotating seat for small island developing states on the Security Council. And we continue, and we see a lot of convergence on that. And of course, for the historical injustice against Africa to be righted. But I can tell you, Gerardo, that I'm not seeing the end of this road on reform very close. But we have to continue to speak on it. And next month in August, Sierra Leone will hold the presidency of the Security Council. And their signature event would be on Security Council reform, which I think is interesting because they brought it in the council. They're a member of the council now. And so we would see a lot of, interesting things here. And the last, I think I have here was about, Renata, Women, Peace and Security. I agree with you completely. One of the things that I'm struck by is when men go to war and they come back, they're considered heroes, right? When men go to war and women are left home and are raped, and we see this happening quite a lot, violence against women in these situations, it's really on the increase. They're considered damaged. And if their husbands do return, in many cases, they don't want them anymore. So women face it twice. They have to fend for their children, and then they're subjected to all this here. And that's just one aspect of it. We've advocated for more, we continue to advocate for more women to be involved in the peace negotiations themselves, because they're the ones suffering the most. Just very, very small numbers, you see. So we will continue to advocate for more women. The UN, I have to say, as the UN, in terms of the peace operations and so on, in terms of special political missions, the UN, I think, has really done a good job. We've seen quite a bit of increase, but in terms of the countries on the ground, we're not seeing that. I think here in Guyana, because I kind of focus more on the conflict areas. We don't have Guyana is not a conflict country. But I think what we've been able to do in Guyana in terms of legislation, in terms of advocacy, I think we're seeing quite a bit of progress. We still have problems with domestic violence. Minister Vindi is here. But this is all our work as well. We have to continue as a country. It's a responsibility for each and every one of us. When we have girls and boys in a home, we should not be having roles, that this is what you should do as a girl. Your brother is not supposed to. Sometimes I think we propagate this kind of, even though we might say we don't, these kinds of social norms. So we all have a role to play in that. Yeşim, I think I answered. Oh. Yeah. The other things that contentious, because you wanted to know, and one of the things that I'm amazed by is one of the very contentious things is to include the phrase right to development in any document. Young people might want to know what is wrong with you people out there in the UN. But human rights is fine. But the minute you want to include right to development, there's a pushback on that. Unilateral coercive measures. That's another big issue, because countries claim that where they have these unilateral coercive measures, this is basically when an individual country puts sanctions on another country, that this is affecting their development. That's another very contentious issue, because some countries argue we need to do this when countries, are not doing what they're supposed to do. But the pandemic showed that UCMs, as we call it, actually caused many people to die because they couldn't get medicine because their country was under unilateral sanction. The Security Council sanctions has the right to sanction, but that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about these sanctions that are by one country on another, and so there's a group of countries that advocate that this should be included in the summit, in the pact for the future. So that's one as well, and as I mentioned, transfer of technology as well. You notice I didn't focus a lot on energy, because that one is not so contentious. I think we all agree that we need to do better on energy for the world, the energy transition, green energy and so on. So that I think is going well. But I've quite a mouthful, right? Good. Thank you.
There are some good news then. I'm going to look around the floor to see if there are some other questions. Oh, I did switch off. Sorry. There you go. Just maybe 2 more questions because we are running over time. Please, gentleman there.
Sure, thank you. First of all, Ambassador, I want to say thank you for your very exemplary service. I think that you have been outstanding, and we really appreciate that. I appreciate as a Guyanese, I can't speak for Guyanese everywhere, but I do. Norwell Hines, University of Guyana Institute for Energy Diplomacy. I have 2 questions. The second, you sort of ended with, but I'll come to that. But the first one has to do with financing for development. 10 years ago, at the FFD3, I was a young person still in that category, and also part of civil society. Guyana, Ambassador Talbert is here, was co-chair at that time. I had the opportunity to go, and I was an advocate. I was doing a lot of protesting and wore Afro and all that. So it was quite a different time for me. But the calculus, especially in Latin America and the Caribbean, has changed considerably recently as Guyana emerges. Back then, a lot of the contention from civil society for financing for development was the burden that was placed on domestic economies. There was a lot of talk that countries need to take a fair share, and our concern was that meant that the domestic contribution would be translated as taxes that get put on people. Guyana, in its emergence, now one of the fastest growing countries in the world, is also being called upon to shoulder some burden for the rest of the world. My question has to do with how does Guyana intend to now use its position, its unique position, one as an emerging economy, also as a country that is now at the Security Council, to really shift the discourse around financing for development. And I think that this has been part of the issue for why we have not seen a lot of movement in developing countries, because of this burden on domestic economies. My second question is more connected to my academic interest. And you ended by saying that energy has not been as contentious, and we have not seen a lot of progress on the sustainable energy for all agenda, in fact. My own perspective on that, and I come from, my academic work is around energy vulnerability, so energy insecurity. And I think that part of that is because we have not been able to really articulate in a strong way the idea of a right to energy. And you talked about the right to development. And this has not been something that has been featured. Do you foresee that Guyana and this is one of Guyana's priorities, areas, as you mentioned, energy insecurity or energy security. Do you think that a right to energy is something that you think the government of Guyana or Guyana would perhaps champion in the global space?
Thank you.
Hey everyone, Madam Ambassador.
Can you introduce yourself, please?
Yeah, I'm Daniel Griffith, currently employed in the renewable energy sector as a solar technician and a current student at the University of Guyana Industrial Engineering. So my question revolves around energy, like you would have stated, and in the earlier part of the session when you would have stated more around climate security. All right, so I am aware that the government of Guyana has made exemplary progress when it comes to renewable energy and making energy and electricity available inside the hinterland regions. However, my current concern is that Guyana as a whole does not see a way to completely phase out our fossil fuel factor when it comes to providing energy to most of our civil areas, well, residents and commercial areas as well. And I am aware that a lot of these industrial companies and industrial sites are under scrutiny from the EPA for the amount of fossil fuels they emit when it comes to their usage of gensets or generators, for a better term, I should say.
So the question is more energy transition.
Correct.
Also for Guyana.
Correct. And how would our infrastructure benefit from this transition? And like it was mentioned earlier, the financial architecture aspect of it as well.
And financing for it. Thank you. One more question then, and we'll wrap up.
Good afternoon. Ambassador, once again, we are very happy to have you, and thank you very much. My name is Neil Bacchus. I'm speaking for some of the religious community. First and foremost, we want to thank you very much for all you're doing, especially with regards to the conflict in Palestine. And religion itself has been a tool for peace of society. Guyana itself has a great model when it comes to religious tolerance. How much of religious dialoguing will be done in this summit in terms of security? And secondly, I'm related to the Indigenous Peoples Commission also. With regards to the food security as well as the climate, we know it will have an impact or directly related to indigenous communities. With regards to land rights and their participation in terms of the food security and then the inclusivity in this summit, how is it this will be adopted? Because right now there seems to be some confusion in Guyana with land rights that it relates to something known as territorial land. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Ambassador, we're putting you on the spot for a lot of issues, but you're used to it. I'm really thrilled to hear the question on Guyana's emerging role now, not least because, of course, as a UN organization, I was personally honored and thrilled when your country stepped up to help my home country, Turkey, when it faced the earthquake, but also then Guyana's increased contributions also to UN entities that are dealing with conflict all around the world. So really, I'm really looking forward to hearing from you on that. Energy transitions, Guyana's own energy transition and its plans, and how do we square a circle, of course. There's that real thing. And Neil, thank you so much for the question on faith-based organizations, the value of that and inclusion of indigenous people.
Thank you very much for the questions. I would start with the doing more. If you get more, do more. That question. I think one has to also recognize in that equation that for many years we knew, at least the government that I serve, we knew what we wanted to do. In fact, earlier today, I was talking with Vice President Jagdeo about some of the things we were talking about so many years ago, the Linden to Lethem Road, the things we wanted to do, and how difficult it was to be able to get financing. We couldn't finance this, or else it would carry our debt burden really, really high, and so on. We were able to do some of these. So my answer to many people when they say, oh, well, your economy is going to grow by over 30% more and so on, is that, but we have a lot of catching up to do. And so we are using our resources to invest in our people and in our country. That doesn't mean that we are not doing what we have to do in terms of our contributions to the international community. This is how it works. For example, our payment to the UN, it is calculated based on your GDP. So already it has increased. It has increased over 100% already, and we are paying that. But we have always been a country, even when we were not in this situation. You will recall that Guyana was ranked #1 in our contribution to Haiti when they had the earthquake, because we contributed $1 million. So per capita, we were the most generous, And many times we don't go out and shout what we do, but we've been doing in many places, even when Japan had its earthquake, and we had Japan was helping us with our conservancy, but as a token of solidarity, we provided a small amount, and we continue to do this. But so we have to balance investing right now in our people, as I said, to bring our country to a particular state of development, and our contributions as well to those who need, because we are part of the global community. In terms of the sustainable energy being a right, energy itself being a right, when you elevate something to a right, you have the concomitant responsibility, and governments can be held to account if you make something a right and you don't fulfill it. And so I think we may have a bit of, even though we may think that it should be a right, and so you may have some legal ramifications with that. But we advocate for energy security all the time as a country, that there should be energy security. One thing I would say is this, that And I know we're going through some growing pains now with our own electricity. I call it growing pains because we are getting out better soon. We are looking at our transition to clean energy, and I think the other question that about the clean energy transition, and I come to that. But I think that we are going to get out of this situation, but our advocacy will continue. If we take, for example, the continent of Africa, 43% of the people have no energy at all, 43%. And we're talking about the sustainable development goals. You know, we're not going to be able to achieve sustainable development goals if people don't have energy. They cannot industrialize and so on. And for a long time, our problem in Guyana has been the cost of energy. And we are going to become competitive as we bring that cost down, and that's what we're working on right now. It brings me to the other question on emissions and the transition. Let me say this, that at least for the next 20, 30 years, the world will still be using fossil fuels. I just want to mention that. So we're not going to be able to phase out fossil fuels tomorrow in the world. Our position as Guyana is that we should not be punished for exploiting our fossil fuel resources because other countries have industrialized and they become developed because they were able to do that. They should be the ones reducing emissions. But we also have another factor. We have a forest. 80% of our country is covered with forests. And so even as we continue to use fossil fuel, we are, we're zero net emitter. So I think that should be factored in. But that said, we are using our resources to transition to clean energy. For the hinterland, it's difficult to put in an entire grid in some places because down there we like to live with space, you know, and by that I mean space between our houses. You know, in Georgetown we hear the neighbor talking, and so in the hinterland we like to have, so to put in lines and so on in some parts might not be feasible. So solar is a good solution there, and that's what we've been doing. And IDB, yes. So in some parts you have that, but in other communities, like in my own community, Morocco, we have put in electricity lines and all of that there. So we are moving on the transition, I would say. Mr. Bacchus, one of the things I love to talk about in the UN is religion, and I say that because I'm proud of my country. We don't have religious tolerance here. We have religious harmony. Harmony is a higher standard than tolerance. Tolerance is, I don't like you, I'm going to tolerate you. Here we celebrate each other's religion. You know, when it's whether it's Pagwa, whether it's Diwali, whether it's Easter or Christmas. And I think we take this for granted. People come here and they're amazed that on Church Street, you have a mosque, a temple, a church in a line up there, and people, you know, greet each other and so on. So I think that when we speak at the UN, we come from a place where we do not know what it is for religion to be a major divider. And I would say to everyone in this room, don't ever let us go down that road. Don't ever let us use that. You know, someone asked me during our signature event, is your president Muslim? Is he the first Muslim president? You know, and I didn't even think about those things, really, because sometimes, you know, we don't see things that way. Indigenous peoples and climate and food security. Most of the outcome documents in the UN speak about indigenous peoples, not just as those affected most by climate change, because they depend so much on the environment, but also as protectors of the environment and the contribution indigenous people bring to the protection of the environment. So I'm sure there's going to be something there. And lastly, on the issue of territorial lands. I was minister when we piloted the Amerindian Act, and I piloted the Amerindian Act. And I'll tell you why issues like territorial lands and traditional lands were not included. Because we don't want indigenous peoples, Amerindians in this country, to have to prove to us that they were 200 years here. The act is simple. once you can prove that you are a community of over 150 for the last 5 years, for 25 years, you entitle to land. It's as simple as that. And so when people talk about territorial lands and traditional lands and so on, you know, I said what we did is far better to make sure indigenous people get their lands and don't make it complicated. Yeşim, that's it.
Thank you. I think there are a few burning questions. How are you doing? Can you take two more if we can? Okay.
But I think you have something else. But I can take it.
I think there are two more questions, but I'm going to ask the audience, please, to direct your questions to the summits and the pact, the Summit of the Future. A lot of the issues on the domestic front, of course, we talk about them all the time. As wonderful as it is to hear from you, I really would love to hear more on how you're seeing the questions around the Pact for the Future and these main chapters of the Summit of the Future. Thank you. Aha.
Good afternoon, Ambassador. Thank you very much for your very clear and concise and comprehensive at the same time. And you managed always to do that so well. My question is actually on the governance aspect for the Summit of the Future. And I think in the brief that has been available online, it's talked about the beyond GDP argument. It's something that we've been flagging for a long time. So my question would be, given that you mentioned in your remarks that turbocharging the accelerated efforts to be able to achieve the SDGs is what's on the plate right now in terms of hoping to be achieved through this, how, in the context of financing and the beyond GDP argument, do we see a building momentum, and what can UN agencies and our bilateral development partners do to support that?
Thank you, Sonia, for that thoughtful question. And how do you see us supporting you here in country and at the global level on that going beyond GDP? Any final going? Oh, Madame Teixeira, Minister Teixeira. But there's recordings, so yeah.
There are issues that I think are futuristic, that we see the embryo now, and I haven't heard them raised. So I just wanted to throw them out for thought. For example, the world of work, the role of trade unions, the role of work. It's now more virtual, and the issue of workers' rights. So if you are now more a worker working in your home, and you have, what are your accident liabilities, your time of hours of work, compensation, maternity leave, etc., things that have been fought for over 100 years for workers' rights. So the issue of the world of work and how the summit will address that and how will the summit accommodate that, because the new world today is going to deal with a new ideology of work and how we deal with human rights of workers and so forth. So that was one thought. The second thing was to do with the social issues that exist. So no issue is raised about social issues. And so we have a world today where, because of COVID, you have a whole set of children across the world who weren't in school, who didn't socialize, who learned school of some form on a tablet or a device, and who now have, it is now being found to have social issues. They have problems with what you call social skills, is that the right word? And these children will be adults, and they're going to be the future. They're going to be the 18-year-olds and 20-year-olds of the summit and the post-summit. These are social issues that the scientists, social scientists, psychologists, whatever you call them, have to be looking at, because you're having, and more people are noticing, you're having a dysfunctional kind of generation that has communication skills problems. And I don't mean to castigate youth in that way, but we all know that children now are too much on machines and tablets and are not communicating and dealing with social problems and social issues and being able to resolve what are normal growing problems that young people have as they go through the years. So that's the second issue I wanted to ask. And I know that Ambassador, has been part of the work of the UN to do with the youth agreement, the youth accord. And so were those some of those issues included that would impact on the summit? The issues that Renata raised of the seed banks, of being able to keep, is it the right word, genomes? I always say it wrong, of making sure that we have control of the products that we produce in the society, naturally, biologically, etc. Those are issues there. One of the concerns, and I'm glad Carolyn raised it, to do with religious harmony. These are issues that are critical to the world, and that we look at how do we develop cultural harmony and religious harmony. I think those were issued. Again, I think you raised at the beginning to do with global governance of the space, which I don't think any of us have been thinking about. It's enough trying to manage here on Earth, much less to try and figure out how you're going to deal with it how are you going to deal with it in space, outer space, and whether that will be a world where the fight for territory and ownership and control, and hopefully not by the same powers who also control the UN Security Council, will transform itself into the outer space. Last point was AI, artificial intelligence, which a lot of work has been going on by the UN, by the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association and the Interparliamentary Union on questions on whether AI is a threat to democracy or is it a facilitator of democracy. And these are big discussions going on in different parliaments and research people to do with AI. So would AI, and how does one manage that and deal with that in terms of a summit of the future? Those are just thoughts I wanted to throw out. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Minister. Thank you, Sonia. I think, one more question, and this is it.
Good afternoon, 𝗂𝗏𝗂𝗃. I'm with the Ethnic Relations Commission. But I'd like to wear my youth cap here. And my question is very simple and very direct. I think it was raised in several different ways by persons. But in thinking of the summit of the future, which it's the completely related to youth and what our future will look like and the future of our children. When I imagine something like this, I would like to think that there's a youth in every room. You mentioned several different discussions happening in different forums, different rooms. Is there a youth in every single room that has a voice in these discussions?
Well, that's a fantastic question. Okay, literally 2 seconds for the next questions. I will turn off your mic.
Good evening, everyone. So my question is sort of related to what the young lady will have shared or asked. Oftentimes at summits like this one, other areas of discussion seem to take the front seat. As we've heard early on, Guyana's priorities are energy, food, and climate securities. But oftentimes, the voices of young people are not amplified in spaces as this one. So, Ambassador, I would just like to know, I've been reading and I read that there is a call for a declaration on future generation regarding youth. Mm-hmm. There is also a call for global youth investment platform and also the establishment of a national youth consultative body. How will you, through the summit and through these different calls, advocate for the amplification of youth voices and participation as it relates to global issues and also national ones? Thank you.
Okay, I think that really we're wrapping up on this note. We're really giving the future to you now. A lot of questions on youth, but also I'm interpreting Minister Teixeira's questions youthfully as well, in that it's about the future of work. that our social problems. Last year, I think at the Committee on the Status of Women, Minister was debriefing us. The issues covered were about women and technology and digital. Like, you know, how do we anticipate, how do you see in your negotiations, member states really anticipating the future problems? In the, you know, I started this with the new, the old, the borrowed, and the blue. I know what the old is, but how do you see really, honest to goodness, our member states bringing the young people into the room? Are they really seeing the new in things? And I'm hearing Sonia's question. I did not hear that going beyond GDP, but that's perhaps also part of the old or the borrowed. There are a lot of good things out there. But really, while we have you here, what I would die to hear is, are member states really doing something new for the future?
I think I would start here. When the term Summit of the Future and the proposal from the SG came about, there were many member states that said, look, we need to fix now. Why are we even thinking so far ahead? What future really are we talking about? Is it beyond 2030? What do we mean by the future? And at a personal level, there's some words I don't like. One is potential, one is resilience, and one is think about the future. Because I think it's what you do now that will determine the future. And the truth is, if we had implemented the Sustainable Development Goals as they are and all the targets would have been met, we would have secured a future that I think we can all be proud of in terms of our legacy. So, in fact, you still have member states that believe we shouldn't even have the Summit of the Future. We should just focus on the implementation of the SDGs. But we're hoping that the summit will turbocharge, to use that term again, the implementation of the SDGs. And so I just wanted to start with that. But Sonia, yes, actually, I'm sure we're going to see something on this, maybe not in the words that we're accustomed to, but there has been a bit of progress. The multidimensional vulnerability index that we've been talking about for a long, long time, that has now been finalized. And we've basically now, the resolution, I think, is worded in a bit of a nuanced way. But now we have something that we can say to the IFI. So you see the IDB is here, and we can say to the IMF and so on. This is what the UN is saying to you, that you need to consider the multidimensional vulnerabilities of countries and do not just look at the GDP. We've just seen what has happened in St. Vincent and the Grenadines and in Grenada, what that hurricane for, you know, one night or some hours, what it has done to the GDP of that country. So you cannot just base your assistance and your concessional financing on GDP per capita. So yes, I would say there is some momentum there. And I think I could say this, that the IFIs have done some tweaking, I've seen, in some areas. And I think it's because of these loud calls. But now we have a document that we will be able to present to them as a UN document. On Minister Gale, I did not mention AI, but AI is one of the topics that's taking up quite a bit of air in the UN, and I think rightfully so. I can tell you the way I see AI. I think it's a force for good, and it's a force for bad. If you have a car, it can take you to places. But if you go at a certain speed and you don't have rules on how to use it, then you can crash and you can kill people. This is the way I see AI. But globally, there has been calls for the regulating of artificial intelligence. And that discussion is very active in the UN right now, Minister Gale. And we're hoping that we're going to be able to make some progress. It's not a very straightforward issue for many. And I would say this, for many small developing countries, it's not even an issue fully understood, and the capacity of our countries to really contribute to this discussion, I think we have to build that capacity as well to contribute to the AI discussion and to make sure that the interests of our countries is protected. On the world of work, I know that the ILO has been doing some work on this. I can't tell you exactly what the wording might be in the pact, but this is something that I know the ILO has been looking at, the changing world of work and what automation is doing and what COVID has done. We still have, I love the UN to death, but we still have many people in the UN that has not returned to the office for, I think, more than 2 days
Not in my
a
office.
week.
Not in our office. Everybody's at the office, and they're here now.
Yes, in New York, you know. So, and member states are saying, look, we need to have people out at work, because it's not just a matter of being able to work from home. Work is where we socialize. Work is where, you know, we really actualize as well. So it may have other impacts. And then the issue of what is the boundary at home. Some people work longer when they work at home. So there are all these issues. I think one country I was reading, I can't remember, it was Brazil, but I know it's in Latin America. You cannot send an email to a staff after working hours. Yes. So, please note, everyone, I was not advocating that for the permanent mission of New York. On the social issues, mental health is also a very big topic right now, and I'm sure there's going to be something there in it on mental health. Studies are coming out that the impact of social media on young people has been very negative. And so I think very soon we may see rules. I see schools already doing it in some parts of the world where children cannot take cell phones, for example, into the classroom and so on. And I think we would see more of that. So I see that happening. Youth, this is another area that we in New York, Guyana, we focus a lot on young people. Our country, the majority of us are young people. Not, you know, we're not youth, but we have a very young country. And look, I think that what I have seen here in terms of the involvement of young people, I think is very commendable. I became a minister at 27, you know, and back then in 2001, I think people thought the president was taking a big risk. Now that can happen, like, you know, our president came in at 27, for example. And so I think we see quite a bit of the involvement of young people. And we will certainly work on more of this. But the youth office, and I was the co-facilitator for that process, establishing the youth office in the UN, they are playing an important role in this Summit of the Future process in terms of the engagement with youth. And so I think you ask Gomin if they're in the room, you know. The negotiations, of course, is intergovernmental by members, so it's up to a member state, you know. But we take a lot from the engagement. You know, we have we know what the issues are in terms of what young people are calling for from the discussions that we've had with youth in the process of establishing the office, but also what we, from right here in Ghana. A lot of times it's also about education. It's about being in decision-making, sort of, I would say, making sure that the policies that we implement take into consideration youth issues. So yes, I would say certainly the discussion on youth will have youth there.
Thank you so much. This is the Pact for the Future that's coming out. It also has a whole paragraph on UN at country level and the work that we need to be doing as UN agencies, which I've been privileged to work with here in Guyana, ensuring that youth are included in all our work plans, etc. I personally just met with the youth, the Assistant Secretary General for Youth. You started your ministerial career at age 27. I started my UN career at age 27. But including young people in the day-to-day of our work is really something that the youth office you establish is holding my office to account, so to make sure that all of us are doing this, and I provide annual reports to the Secretary General on all of this. And I'm heartened to hear that you're committed to hear from young people. But I'm also not necessarily hearing, and this is not a criticism, but I'm not hearing like 2 out of the so many, 10 delegates on da committee will be young people, right? We didn't hear that either. So I will, as a UN official, I encourage all member states to bring more young people into their delegations. I was so honored to see, for instance, that recently persons with disability having a lot more visibility in the UN or fora that you're hosting and organizing and participating in the government's delegations, similarly with indigenous people. But really, let's now ask you for the number of young people we will ask you going forward, hold you and hold us as the UN to account on how many young people. No, I started at 27, and it's been some years, so I don't qualify in that category, nor does Jillian, nor does Gerardo. But how many young people are in the system? We're getting more and more metrics on how many young people we're recruiting, what is the age level of the people we're recruiting, not just as interns. So really, really hold us, especially youth representatives around the room, hold us to account, ask us those questions.
Just before sorry, Minister. Yeah. Yes.
But we met that at the UN. We're relatively good with women.
Yeah. I want to say this though, that in the discussion on establishing the youth office, you wouldn't believe what was one of the issues. What is the age limit to be considered a youth?
I'm good with 52.
And I remember this like yesterday, because we had to determine the head of the office had to be on the Secretary General level or Assistant Secretary General, ASG. And when we look across the UN, what was the average age
of the ASGs?
Of an ASG? It was nothing near to
like
35 or 40. It was very,
yeah.
And so we, as co-facilitator, myself and the ambassador of Egypt, we asked for, some of these statistics. And I remember the delegation from the European Union. Are you here?
No,
yes. They didn't want this issue of putting an age, right? And my colleague from Egypt said, well, you in Europe have a lot of old people, so you wouldn't know. And I'm like, we're going to break up this negotiation.
Yeah. This is not going in a good direction.
And then Cuba came with a solution and said, well, if you finish high school, it's by 17. If you go to university, by the time you have a master's, you're like maybe 23, 24. If we need somebody with experience, they may probably have to have about 3 years. So the age we came up with was 35.
Okay.
You, at the time of appointment, you must be 35
or below.
Or below, So even who is a youth, and some delegations are saying, don't say youth, say younger persons.
Persons.
So when you ask about,
it's all relative.
We would like to see delegations with youth, right? If you take, for example, our delegation to the Permanent Forum of Indigenous People, I think except for the minister who, would not qualify as youth, everybody else there it's a young person.
Okay.
And when the Tushao got up and spoke, and he said, "I'm the Tushao of my village, and I'm 20-some," and I'm like, we didn't bring him as a youth. We brought him as a leader of a village. So I think we're not doing bad at all.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good. Of course, there was an answer, of course, for that immediately, so I really, really appreciate it. You've been an amazing audience. You did mention the EU. Due to travel and COVID, the relevant colleagues could not. But I also wanted to acknowledge him because they've been huge advocates of the summit, funding also youth advocates from Guyana as well, youth volunteers, etc. So I really wanted to acknowledge their contribution. And when I don't see them in the room, you don't remember, out of sight, out of mind. So I'm very glad you raised that. As I said, the pact does include your UN family here also in the language. I encourage you to take a look at that, not least because you should hold us to account on our work. It's been just an amazing pleasure to have you, Ambassador, here to discuss about the future of the UN. When I listen to you and I hear everybody else in the room, I actually have hope that our system, which has really been stretching at the seams and dealing with this can be stood up, can be strengthened, reinvigorated with the energy, the determination, the commitment to the old, the new, the borrowed, and the blue. I'm really, really heartened by this level of support, and I thank you so much. If there are any concluding words, with that, I thank everyone. There are some refreshments being served. Absolute privilege to have this discussion with all of you, my UN agency colleagues, UNFPA, UNDP, FAO in the room, and others, in all the representatives of youth and government and other entities, honorable ministers. Thank you, and diplomatic partners and colleagues and high commissioners. Thank you so much. What a privilege. And Ambassador Rodrigues, thank you for your wisdom, for your energy. Thank you.
Gentlemen, just one update. It's buffet style, so please help yourself to some refreshments.